The transport shuttle rumbled gently as it landed on the icy surface of 6-9, a desolate moon with a paper-thin atmosphere and a reputation for devouring light. Logan Hale sat upright in his seat, watching through the frost-glazed window as the terrain unfolded in endless shades of gray and violet. Thin, jagged rocks jutted out from the ground like the broken bones of some ancient beast, and in the far distance, the outline of the test field, a wide crater rimmed with metallic pylons, came into view. The airlock hissed open, and Logan stepped out into the stillness, pulling his thermal cloak tighter around his shoulders. His breath clouded instantly, even inside the dome's temporary oxygen field, and above him, 6-9's pale twin moons shimmered like frosted pearls against the black canvas of space. This was no ordinary survival test. The Galactic Inter-Academy Challenge was an elite examination, reserved for the most promising cadets from across the Allied systems. Every participant had trained for years, yet few had faced the kind of isolation 6-9 promised. The twist this time was brutal in its simplicity. No artificial light was allowed for the full 72-hour duration of the test. No lamps, no torches, no heating coils, only the environment, the body, and the mind. An alien instructor hovered in the center of the crater, his iridescent wings folded behind his back. His voice, amplified by a translator node, echoed clearly through the oxygen dome. "Welcome, cadets. You will each be assigned a sector. Your goal is to remain functional and alert for 72 hours. You may build shelters, gather natural resources, and share nothing. Breaking the light restriction will result in immediate disqualification. Your implants will record violations." The participants formed a rough semicircle around him. Logan counted 30 others, cadets of every known species. To his right stood a four-eyed Glakari female with skin like polished obsidian, her face painted in ritualistic yellow swirls. On his left, a tall, scaled Tarani male bounced on the balls of his clawed feet, muttering nervously. Many looked confident, armed with exotic survival gear and muscle memory from years of field drills. Logan carried only a thin pack, an emergency thermal wrap, a shattered solar compass he'd kept for sentimental reasons, and a journal made of wax paper and string. Some aliens sneered when they noticed. He didn't respond. He rarely did. The sectors were assigned by the instructor's drone, which scanned each cadet and projected a glyph onto the surface in front of him. Logan's glyph was a narrow crescent with 2 dots, Sector 13. He made his way across the ridge, descending a steep slope of icy shale into a shallow valley where sharp stones stuck out at awkward angles and strange blue moss pulsed faintly underfoot. He walked until he reached a natural depression that offered partial cover from wind. It was here, in a hollow formed by 2 cracked boulders, that Logan unpacked his gear and sat down. The daylight on 6-9 was faint and short. Within an hour of setup, the temperature dropped sharply, and a dim gray dusk settled across the crater. The sun, little more than a red smear on the horizon, disappeared behind the crags. Logan watched the shadows stretch and merge until the last traces of light faded. The rules said no artificial light, but it didn't forbid observation, and Logan was already looking for loopholes. He noted how the ground cooled unevenly, how certain crystals embedded in the stone retained a weak glow for minutes longer than others. More importantly, he realized that the twin moons cast just enough ambient light to outline the terrain, barely, but it was something. Most cadets wouldn't think it mattered. Most of them came from species that relied on thermal sensors, sonar, or integrated goggles. Humans had none of those things. Logan had something different. He had patience. By the second hour of night, a low hum rose through the ground. It wasn't mechanical, it was the planet itself, vibrating softly as if in sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a Glakari cadet screamed. The sound echoed, then vanished into the cold. Logan remained still, wrapping his thermal sheet around himself like a cocoon. He didn't need to move. He needed to think. The darkness was absolute. He stretched out his hand in front of his face and saw nothing. But when he turned his head slightly, a faint shimmer caught his eye. Above him, the larger of 6-9's moons reflected off a distant sheet of frost-covered rock. The angle was perfect. He realized he could manipulate that. If he could find similar reflective materials, he might bounce the moonlight back down into his shelter. He reached into his pack and pulled out the broken solar compass. Its inner reflective dish, though cracked, could be repositioned. Logan unscrewed the casing with the edge of a flattened knife and carefully peeled the reflective foil from the backing. It wasn't much, but it was enough for testing. He propped it between two rocks, angling it toward the brightest moon, and waited. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, a faint sliver of silver light crept across the inside wall of his shelter. It was too dim to read by, but it was visible. In total darkness, even a sliver mattered. The first night was far from over, but Logan had already started building something. Not a fire, not a gadget, but a theory. He scribbled a note in his wax journal. Light can be redirected. Mirrors work. Need more. His fingers were stiff from the cold, but his mind was alive with plans. He would test water reflectivity. He would examine broken visors from discarded equipment. He would explore mineral surfaces for natural reflectors. He knew he wouldn't sleep much, not in the cold, not with the shadows, not when his brain refused to stop spinning. But he didn't mind. Logan Hale had never been the fastest, the strongest, or the loudest cadet. But when others ran in circles or collapsed under pressure, he sat still and listened. On 6-9, where light was forbidden and fear was a natural byproduct of darkness, he understood that adaptation wouldn't come from panic. It would come from perception. In the total black of Sector 13, Logan didn't panic. He observed. While others screamed or waited for rescue, he tilted broken metal and mapped the moonlight. He didn't need fire to survive the night. He needed reflection, and the moon never looked brighter. The cold was crueler than Logan had anticipated. It wasn't just the kind of biting chill that made the fingers go numb. It was the sort that felt intelligent, creeping through the seams of fabric, sliding beneath the skin, curling up beside the bones, and whispering that nothing would warm him again. He sat in silence, listening to the sharp crack of rocks adjusting to the night air. The thermal sheet around his body trapped enough warmth to keep him conscious, but not enough to make rest possible. Sleep was not an option. Not tonight. Above the crater, a gust of sharp wind whipped through the ravine, scattering loose pebbles and brittle moss. He could hear it coming before it arrived, whistling through narrow gaps and slicing through the dead air like an unseen predator. It howled across the ridges and slammed into the lower sectors. He imagined what it would feel like without shelter. In some parts of the crater, the terrain was fully exposed. Logan had chosen his location for a reason. Still, the rocks only blocked part of the wind. The rest of it slithered in, making the thin layer of heat around him feel almost insulting. Then came the noise. At first it was a single voice, female, Glakari, by the sound of the hissing syllables. She cried out in fear, no words, just sound. It came from somewhere above, in one of the mid-sectors. Logan didn't move. Seconds later, another scream followed, this time lower in pitch, filled with panic. More voices joined. One of the cadets was shouting commands. It was the Tirani male he had seen earlier, his deep tone unmistakable, but his orders were panicked, disorganized. The shadows had begun to fracture the nerves of the group. Logan shifted his body to lie flatter against the stone wall behind him, angling his head toward the sky. The moons still hung in their positions, one higher than the other, both pale and unwavering. Their light touched the rocks in brief silvery patches. He tried to trace how far that glow traveled. It didn't reach very far. He needed more surface, more angles, more reflection. A new sound erupted from the opposite side of the crater, something metallic, something breaking. The crack of a snapped survival rod echoed sharply. Then silence. A moment later, the instructor's deep monotone drifted across the communication channel in his ear. Sector 8. Disqualification confirmed. Light device activated. Removal in progress. Logan exhaled quietly. One down. The problem wasn't that the rules were harsh. It was that most cadets never considered a universe without technology. For beings who had never needed to build fire from friction or navigate by star patterns, a night without tools was not just inconvenient, it was terrifying. Some of the species present had evolved with night vision, but even that required contrast. 6-9 offered none. The surface was as reflective as soot. The horizon dissolved into the sky after sundown, and no one could tell where solid ground ended and empty space began. He closed his eyes and tried to remember something his grandfather once told him. Something about navigating by listening. It wasn't the method that mattered, his grandfather had said. It was the calm. Logan focused on the rhythm of sounds. The wind returned. Footsteps, panicked, rushed, crunched against gravel in the distance. Someone fell. Then a high-pitched whine erupted from one of the neural comms. Someone was crying. He rolled to his side, pressing his body closer to the rocks to maintain what little warmth he had. Another disqualification followed. This time it came with no warning. A bright flare shot into the air from Sector 2, violently white against the black dome. The flare painted the inside of the crater in ghostly hues for exactly 6 seconds before it vanished. Logan had seen it from the corner of his eye, his head angled slightly upward. The moonlight seemed stronger afterward, though he knew it wasn't. It was only contrast. The real trick would be turning that illusion into something permanent. He reached behind his back and retrieved the shard of reflective metal he had placed earlier. It was still angled toward the higher moon, still catching a thin sliver of light. That light had moved now, resting against the opposite rock wall of his shelter, too faint to be useful. He needed it to bounce inward, not outward. Logan gritted his teeth against the cold and crawled forward, lifting the shard with frozen fingers. He repositioned it, wedging the metal between 2 smaller stones until it tilted inward at a better angle. He waited. 10 minutes passed. The moon shifted a degree or two. Then it happened. The light returned to his space, not as a beam, but as a shimmer on the ground. He smiled faintly. It wasn't warmth, but it was presence. He took his wax paper notebook and scratched out a diagram of the reflector's new position. Then he circled a single word: multiply. A sudden thud from the direction of Sector 6 startled him. Something large had collapsed, not a cadet, something heavier. Another gust of wind raced down the slope, followed by a dry, rattling sound. It reminded him of bones in a can. 6-9 was home to several species of nocturnal predators, but none were listed in the exam briefing as aggressive. Still, the darkness made their presence psychological weapons. He heard chitons scraping against stone, then silence. For a few moments, he considered moving his position, but it would be suicide to stumble through that terrain without preparation. If he left now, he might trigger an accident, or worse, attract attention from above. He remained where he was, his eyes fixed on the moon, his mind trying to calculate distances. He would need more reflectors. Water, perhaps? If he could create a shallow pool, even that might bounce light. The idea excited him, but there were risks. Moving water meant leaving the shelter. Leaving meant exposure. Hours passed, though he had no way of knowing how many. The cold had moved from painful to dull. His body adjusted in the way only desperation allows. Across the crater, the voices had mostly stopped. No one dared speak now. The wind howled louder as if mocking their silence. Logan's small patch of reflected moonlight remained. It was no brighter than a candle's flicker, but it was his. It had not come from technology, programming, or ancient knowledge. It had come from looking, from noticing, from not panicking. In his journal, he wrote again, "In dark, shadows deceive. In silence, shape becomes tool." His handwriting had become shaky, but he didn't stop. He wrote down a list of items he needed in the morning: flat stones, clear water, ice sheets, and damaged tech with reflective backing. He would collect only what others had abandoned. He would not break the rules. He would not ask for help. He pressed his back against the rock once more and looked up. The moons had moved slightly, but the larger one remained centered in his view. He closed one eye and began to trace its arc, committing it to memory. If he could predict its motion, he could predict where to move the reflectors. He was no engineer by title, but he was something older, something humans used to be before machines. He was a thinker in the dark, and the dark had never frightened him, not really. Another scream erupted somewhere beyond the ridge. He ignored it, let the others panic. He was building something. By the time the second morning's light crept back over the crater rim, Logan was already on his feet. His knees cracked as he stood, and his muscles ached from the cold, but he didn't allow himself to hesitate. The moons had completed their course, leaving behind only a soft, dim haze that scattered weakly across the jagged horizon. His fingers were numb, but his thoughts were sharp. He had one goal now: expand. The reflector he had crafted through the night still held its position, wedged between two stones, catching the last of the moon's light like a pale tongue of silver fire. But that single beam was not enough. If he wanted to light his shelter area fully, or better yet, warm it, he would need more surfaces, more angles, and more creativity. Logan dropped to one knee and examined the surroundings. His sector was rich with smooth shale and sharp mineral plates, though most had irregular edges. What he needed were large, flat surfaces with at least partial reflectivity. He scanned the rocks again, and then his eyes landed on a patch of ice halfway down the slope. He moved quickly, careful not to disturb the fragile footing. The ice wasn't thick, but it was wide, transparent and smooth. It had formed over a basin that had likely once held water before freezing solid under the night's frost. He took out his blade and chipped away the thinnest layer near the edge. The fragment that came off was jagged, but caught the morning light with enough clarity to give him hope. He placed it on the ground, angling it toward a rock, and watched as it refracted a narrow line of brightness onto the stone surface. That was all the proof he needed. Logan returned to his shelter with 2 sheets of cracked ice and a shard of white mineral he had never seen before. The mineral had a chalky texture, but when polished against his sleeve, it reflected with a pearlescent sheen. He anchored the mineral piece upright, using a wedge of stone, and placed one ice sheet beneath it, tilted slightly to catch the ambient light. As he stepped back, he saw his shelter brighten just enough for shadows to form. Shadows created not by darkness, but by the presence of indirect light. He exhaled slowly, the fog of his breath curling upward into the pale air. It was working. His next step was to gather discarded equipment. During his descent to the lower ledge, he had seen what looked like a shredded mylar blanket tangled in a pile of rocks. He knew some cadets had abandoned gear during the chaos. Most alien cadets didn't understand the value of what seemed broken or obsolete. To Logan, however, everything could be repurposed. The blanket was stuck between 2 jagged stones, its edges caught on crystallized thorns. He cut it free carefully, folding it into a tight bundle. The reflective material was scratched and torn, but the inner side remained mostly intact. Mylar was excellent at bouncing heat and light. Even in its damaged state, it would serve as a valuable tool. He climbed back to his camp, sweating now despite the cold, his breath shallow from the thin air. He unrolled the material and hung it like a curtain from 2 upright rods of shale, forming a sloped panel angled toward the sun's path. It wouldn't catch much light in the early hours, but when the sun dipped westward, it would reflect into the deeper corner of the shelter. Logan took several steps back and studied his growing system of mirrors and reflectors. The crude architecture of his camp no longer resembled a survival station. It looked more like an optical experiment from the ancient past. a geometry of ice, stone, metal, and light. He sat down, not to rest, but to measure the effect. His shelter was brighter now. Not warm exactly, but no longer entombed in shadow. The difference was subtle, yet undeniable. An hour passed before the silence broke. A low hum buzzed across the private channel in his ear. Then a voice. "Cadet Hale, this is Commander Veer. Are you conscious?" Logan tapped his transmitter once in confirmation. The instructor's voice returned, this time tighter, curious. "Do you require extraction?" "No," Logan answered quietly. "I'm operational." There was a pause. Then the connection severed without a farewell. He smirked. The observers had noticed. That was good. Not for the sake of ego, but because it meant he had done something measurable, something visible on the satellites. He had altered the terrain using primitive logic. As the day dragged on, the moons disappeared from sight and the sun crawled along its shallow arc. It never rose high, never offered more than a dull orange smear across the upper edge of the sky. But Logan used what it gave him. With the light slowly moving westward, he adjusted his mylar panel twice, using a triangular rock as a fulcrum and pressing one end into the soil to tilt the angle. He watched the sunlight scatter into the shelter's rear wall and dance across the ice shard like fractured glass. Then he heard it. Movement. Not the wind, not rockfall. Footsteps. Slow, cautious ones. He turned his head without rising. A silhouette moved near the edge of his sector. It was the Tarani male, the same cadet who had shouted commands during the first night. His posture was low, cautious, and his arms hung stiffly at his sides. Logan didn't speak. The Tarani moved forward 2 more steps, then stopped at the boundary line etched by a ridge of cracked stone. He didn't cross it. "I'm not here to interfere," the cadet muttered. His voice was hoarse. "I saw light." Logan nodded but said nothing. The Tarani looked over the strange assembly of reflectors, then back at Logan. "How?" Logan answered without emotion. "By not looking for brightness, just looking for bounce." The Tarani gave a small snort, something halfway between a laugh and a cough. He took a slow step back. "Others won't last. One claw's already broken. 2 of us bit each other by mistake." He glanced toward the horizon. "We thought we saw something in the dark." Logan leaned forward and placed a hand on the ice panel, steadying it. "You probably did." "Will you share it?" the cadet asked. "Your setup." "No," Logan said plainly. "That's not how this works." "I figured," the Tarani murmured. "Still, thanks for showing me it's possible." He turned and walked away, vanishing into the dim light. Logan returned to his notes. He wrote the time, estimated angles, and drew 3 new diagrams of alternative setups. He would try water next, maybe frozen sheets thawed just enough to smooth the surface. If he could create a panel that combined reflection and mild heat retention, he might survive the second night without the thermal wrap. In the late afternoon, a breeze stirred the mineral dust near the base of his shelter. He inhaled slowly, his body trembling with fatigue, but his spirit sharper than ever. The system was crude, the materials were random, but the effect, it was tangible. He had built something from fragments of things no one else cared about. He had redirected nature with nothing but observation and thought. The second night was coming. He didn't fear it. He welcomed it. Because now he had shadows that danced. As the second sunset folded the dim sky back into shadow, Logan adjusted the final angle of his largest reflector. The mylar sheet now formed a diagonal barrier that redirected the fading light into the core of his shelter, bouncing it across a smooth mineral plate that glimmered faintly. He secured the base of the setup with a forked bone he had found near the edge of his sector, a clean white fragment that had likely once belonged to a scavenger species. He didn't know what it was. He only knew it fit the slot perfectly. He stepped back to observe. The shimmer held, bouncing softly through the angled plates and settling in a diffuse glow across the floor. It wasn't bright, but it was wide. That meant visibility. That meant security. And now, as the temperature dropped and the sky melted into darkness once more, Logan stood in the center of a space that had shape, that had contour, that defied the void surrounding it. Then he heard her. The voice was soft at first, nearly indistinct beneath the hiss of the wind. "Logan," the voice called again. "Are you functional?" It was Jara, the Glakari cadet he had seen during the orientation. She emerged from the slope just above his ridge, her form outlined against the pale starlight. Her limbs were trembling, and her obsidian skin reflected the moonlight in dull streaks. He noticed her forearms were wrapped in cloth, blood seeping through the fibers. She stopped a few meters from his camp and stared at the scattered panels of ice, rock, and metal that ringed his shelter like a crude machine of mirrors. Her four eyes narrowed, and she blinked slowly, the way Glakari blinked when confused or amazed. "You made a dome of light," she said in disbelief. Logan didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, picked up a flat stone, and scraped it across the inner curve of his reflector to clean the condensation. Then he gestured toward the rocks near the edge. "You can sit there," he said simply. She obeyed without protest. She sat stiffly, her hands pressed to her chest, breathing heavily. "My comms failed," she muttered. "I wandered too far last night. I thought I could trace the ridge, but I got turned around." Logan crouched near his water basin, a wide bowl-shaped rock that he had filled earlier with thawed ice, and passed her a scoop. She drank quickly, greedily. Then she exhaled and looked at him again. "You're not afraid of the dark, are you?" "No," Logan said. "It's just another condition." Jara shifted slightly, studying the walls of his camp. "Others are trying to follow you. The Tyranni returned this morning with stories about your mirrors. Some cadets went looking for ice to copy you. A few were hurt. One fell. He cracked his jaw. Another tried to shape his blade into a curve and nearly sliced off his own finger." Logan stared at her. "You're telling me this because you want something." She looked away, embarrassed, then nodded. "I'm not here to copy. I already failed. I activated an optical beacon last night for 5 seconds. The instructors didn't catch it. It was weak, buried behind a rock, but still. I shouldn't be here. I needed to see it, to see that someone didn't break." He said nothing. Jara stood slowly and walked to the edge of the camp, careful not to cast shadows across his main panel. "You could help them," she whispered. "You could tell them how." "That's not the exam," Logan replied. "I know," she said, "but the exam was written by people who never spent a night on this moon." Logan turned back to his notebook, flipping through the wax pages until he found his last set of diagrams. The latest angle he had used for the secondary reflector had increased the illumination range by nearly 30%. He had annotated the mineral properties, the expected refraction loss, and the estimated durability of the ice sheets. He paused, then made a note. Others observing, risk of mimicry, ethical dilemma, share or withhold. The silence returned. Jara was still standing at the edge, her body outlined by the silvery wash of the reflected moonlight. He wondered how many others were watching from the shadows. Not all would approach. Some would simply wait. Some would steal ideas. Others would break in their own silence. A rustle in the distance made him freeze. A second figure appeared, not moving toward him but circling the upper ridge slowly, carefully, as if measuring the light spread. He couldn't identify the species, but the broad silhouette and curved headplate suggested a Gornathi scout. That meant word had spread farther than he had imagined. Jara stepped closer. "That's the third one I've seen tonight. They're not here for confrontation. They're here because they hope you'll leave something behind." Logan stood, stretching the stiffness from his back, then reached into his pouch and withdrew a thin strip of aluminum-backed plastic. It was torn from the lining of his thermal wrap, barely 10 centimeters long, but he had polished it against his boot for hours. He walked to a small pile of stones on the outer edge of his shelter and placed it atop a flat surface, facing upward at a gentle slope. It caught the moonlight instantly, throwing a faint gleam toward the tree line. Zara watched in silence. "You're going to bait them," she said. "I'm going to show them it's possible," Logan corrected. She looked at him with something close to admiration. "Why now?" He stared out into the dark. "Because I want them to survive. But I want them to think first." The rest of the night passed in a slow procession of silence and movement. Logan remained awake, monitoring the shift of the moons, adjusting his panels twice to maintain optimal angles. He noted every adjustment, sketched every change. Twice he spotted shadows moving just beyond the reach of his reflectors, cadets creeping toward the glinting bait piece, hoping to examine it up close. He didn't interfere. Zara dozed briefly, her back pressed to a warm rock that had absorbed sunlight earlier. When she awoke, her eyes met his, and she didn't speak. She knew she had been permitted to stay. That was enough. As the sky began to pale with the gray wash of morning, Logan rose and walked to the outer panel, tilting it slightly to catch the low sun. The ice around his water basin had held, and the mylar curtain still fluttered lightly in the wind. Everything was intact. He had endured again. He returned to his notebook and wrote 2 lines. "Light is not given. It is redirected. Survival is not taught. It is understood." Then he tore the page out, folded it twice, and placed it under the bait reflector. Let them find it. Let them think. Let them build. The darkness was no longer an enemy. It had become a challenge, one he had already answered. By the time the third and final night arrived, Logan no longer flinched when the darkness fell. The sky dimmed as if a curtain were being pulled over a stage, yet his shelter remained visible. The mirrors he had angled throughout the day, each carefully adjusted to follow the arc of the moonlight, formed an interconnected array that caught, redirected, and amplified the silvery beams. The space inside was no longer a cold pit. It was an enclosure of fractured light, scattered reflections, and the soft hum of a presence that pushed against the void. He no longer sat in darkness. He sat in engineered twilight. He had extended his reflector system twice during the afternoon. First, by splitting one of the remaining ice panels in half and propping each angled piece along a natural bend in the slope. Second, by creating a primitive parabolic curve using shards of transparent minerals embedded into a concave strip of fabric. When he tested it at sundown, the moonlight struck the curve and bounced forward in a narrow, concentrated beam. It lasted for only 7 minutes before the angle shifted, but it was enough to prove the concept. He recorded everything in his journal. There were no wasted moments now. Everything either served survival or understanding. Zara had left before the sun reached its highest point. She hadn't spoken much during the morning. Before departing, she had placed her hand over the mineral reflector he had anchored beside his sleeping spot, pressing her palm flat against its surface. "I thought I knew how to adapt," she had said. "But what I saw here, what you built, it wasn't just for you. It was a blueprint for how not to panic." He had nodded but offered no reply. Once she disappeared beyond the ridge, Logan cleaned the reflective surfaces again, wiping away condensation and adjusting the tilt. His breath hung in the air in short clouds. He no longer bothered with the thermal wrap. Movement generated enough heat, and his body had grown used to the rhythm of effort. He noticed fewer sounds from across the crater now. Either the others had succeeded in making their own shelters, or they had been extracted. In either case, the silence had changed. It no longer felt like fear. It felt like observation. He stood at the edge of his zone and stared upward at the larger moon. It sat directly above the horizon, perfectly positioned to illuminate his camp for the next few hours. He smiled faintly. The moon had become his ally, passive, silent, but reliable. What had once been a distant object in a hostile sky was now an engine for survival. Just as he turned to retrieve more mineral fragments from his pile, a low hum vibrated through the ground beneath him. At first, he thought it was the wind returning, but the vibration was too steady. Then came the voice, deep, composed, and unfamiliar. "Cadet Logan Hale," the voice announced across the crater through the instructor channel. "Remain still. Your exam has been observed." Logan froze. The hum rose slightly, and within seconds a small aerial drone, shaped like a thin disk with 6 tiny stabilizers, appeared over the ridge and hovered above his position. Its surface glowed faintly, scanning him with rotating blue light. "You are not in violation," the voice confirmed. "You have completed 71 hours and 22 minutes of uninterrupted survival without artificial light. Your zone has remained intact. Your solution has been deemed non-intrusive and within the ethical framework of the challenge." Logan said nothing. He waited. "You are being documented," the voice continued. "Your reflector system has been reviewed by interspecies analysts from the Galactic Survival Commission. You have not only passed, your approach is being archived for instructional study." The drone rotated in place. "We will remain silent until the final extraction. Proceed freely." Then the feed cut. Logan exhaled once, slowly, and dropped to one knee. He wasn't overwhelmed. He wasn't proud. What he felt was something quieter, deeper, confirmation. His decisions had not just helped him survive, they had reshaped what others thought possible. He rose and returned to work. The final hours passed without chaos. He caught a glimpse of movement along the southern slope, 2 cadets dragging a slab of metal between them, their bodies hunched against the wind. Farther along the western edge, a line of glowing rocks illuminated a trail that hadn't existed before. Others had tried to replicate what he'd started. Some had failed. Some had succeeded. That was not his concern anymore. He had never intended to lead anyone. He had only needed to endure. The rest had followed because truth, when demonstrated, did not require permission. At precisely the 72-hour mark, a low rumble rolled through the crater floor. The air shimmered faintly, and the sky cracked with the appearance of a wide portal above the center dome. A massive transport descended, black, silent, and shaped like a flattened spear. Its presence dwarfed the crater, yet it touched down without disturbing the reflective setups scattered throughout the zone. Logan waited until the extraction drone hovered near his camp and issued the confirmation signal. He packed his journal, wrapped the last remaining reflector in a cloth pouch, and gave one final glance at the space he had built. It no longer looked like a random pile of objects. It looked deliberate, elegant, a monument to method. He stepped into the shuttle and didn't look back. Inside the transport, instructors from 6 species sat in observation booths. Some watched screens, some spoke into their comms. One turned toward him, a short-winged instructor from a lesser-known atmospheric planet. She did not smile. She simply nodded and tapped twice on her pad. As Logan took his seat, a familiar voice from the opposite side of the aisle spoke. "You built light from nothing." It was the Tyranny cadet. His arm was in a sling and his jaw was bruised, but his eyes were alert. He studied Logan as if trying to memorize his posture, his expression, his silence. "You didn't need to say anything," the Tyranny said. "You just did it. That was enough." Logan leaned back and closed his eyes. When the transport lifted off, the crater shrank below them, fading into a swirl of black and violet. The moon still hovered above, indifferent but steady. The instructors began their reviews. Debriefs started, and across the monitored screens, Sector after sector showed fragments of reflectors, makeshift mirrors, light-bending water dishes, and angular shelters drawn from one source of inspiration: a single cadet who had refused to be afraid of the dark. Logan Hale didn't break records for strength, speed, or aggression. He didn't win by overpowering the elements. He won by listening to them. While others scrambled in fear, he mapped the shadows. While others begged for light, he bent the moonlight to his will. His name entered the galactic archives not as a hero of battle, but as a reminder. In silence, there is structure. In darkness, there is shape. And in the absence of answers, the one who asks the right questions builds the path forward. The test had ended, but the lesson had only begun.